It's the day after the election. I don't know if any of you caught my little joke. If you looked at the thumb that I used yesterday, I had basically had a red wave for the thumb. I took that red wave thumb and placed it in the wine glass of the pretty girl who's in my thumb. So, day after, what's going on at the moment? Well, it's looking like the GOP will pick up the House, albeit with a much narrower margin. Senate still up for grabs. Right now, people are leaning towards it remaining 50-50 split, but the potential of the GOP having a 51-49 advantage is still in play and not like a huge outside chance. It's still very possible. So, the first thing to understand is the polls failed. Yes. I did an earlier video on this, which hopefully will be popping up here somewhere on the screen, explaining why polls are so difficult to do and why they rarely work. And so essentially what happened is the media picked up these polls and created completely different expectations of what were actually in reality. So we're at the point now where Democrats are out dancing in the streets because they didn't lose as bad as they thought they were going to, and the GOP is all pulling their hairs out and rending their clothes because they won, but they didn't have the big gigantic blowout they were hoping to have. And so if you understand the underlying weaknesses of polls in the first place, then you have to understand what media does with stuff like that. Essentially, the polls were clickbait. Essentially, the more dire the predictions were made, the more awful the predictions were made, it essentially functioned like clickbait, rage bait, bringing people in to hear the great news people explain why the polls were actually right. Then occasionally creating some churn by having somebody like Michael Moore coming out and saying, no, there's going to be a blue tsunami. So, and I got sucked in a bit too, because I mean, if all you're hearing is that there's going to be this gigantic victory, and everybody's pretty much saying it, even the other side is kind of like at the point where they're almost sounding like they're desperately trying to counter the other narrative. So I kind of expected to be sitting here tonight giving you a video talking about various leftists losing their mind, banging their heads against walls and screaming and just doing totally irrational things, watching Portland burn to the ground, other things like that. And probably for the best that we're where we're at, because yeah, the GOP, if they had one as big as they said they were, what they were hoping, then we'd have the awful truth of watching the next 2 years of them still not being able to do anything. So essentially, we'll get gridlock, and gridlock's an okay thing. Gridlock's better than a functional government. So the question is how well did the GOP do? Now, if you get rid of expectations, where you sit there and say, well, we're expecting them to take 100% of all Congress. Well, that was never going to happen, and most of the wide end expectations of getting like a filibuster proof Senate and other things like that were preposterous. So if you take out the expectations and look at what were the actual metrics, what did the GOP do? Well, at this point, it appears they won the House. That's a win. The House functions with a simple majority, so even if they end up only one congressman over, they won. So that's all you can really hope for. It means they get to set up the committees the way they want to. It means they get to set up the House leadership. Uh, yeah, they won. Okay, well, the other thing is they probably didn't lose the Senate. It's probably going to be 50-50. It may be 51-49. Uh, so that's not bad either. So one of the things people miss, and I picked this up, I had to do some errands tonight and forgot my Bluetooth stuff, so I had to end up listening to talk radio and was listening to Levine, and he actually brought up a really good point, something I hadn't heard before. Is this concept? It's not a concept; it's a actual thing that's currently in play, where because of the Senate is elected every 2 years, roughly a third the Senate. Every 2 years, roughly a third the Senate. So one of the phenomenons that's popped up is we get into a situation where, depending on which 2 year cycle it is, one party is disproportionately represented as the party that's essentially defending the most turf. So what happened here is this was the year where the Republicans were actually defending more turf than the Democrats. So the idea that defending, essentially, if you've got more races up in the air than the other side, you're at a disadvantage. And functioning at a disadvantage, if you come up with, if you don't lose ground or even gain a little bit, even a single seat, that's actually not bad. Levine also pointed out that in 2024, it's going to be completely reversed. It's going to be the Democrats who are going to be defending more ground in terms of how many Senate seats are going to be open. And it's actually going to be much more than this one. So pointing out that this could be the beginning of something bigger. Will it? Don't know. But it's an interesting thing to look at. Okay, so another thing to understand is that a lot of these candidates were complete unknowns thrown up against incumbents. They were horribly underfunded. Uh, they didn't have the ability. A lot of them didn't know how to run campaigns, and they got brutalized by mainstream media for the entire length of the campaign season. And overall, they had and they were somewhat radical as well. And overall, they had an overall improvement in terms of voter access, voting for them during the campaign. So if you look at it just as a gross, how much percentage of the people voted for certain people or voted for certain candidates, uh, the general percentage across the board is about 5% more people voted for Republicans than they did last time. And looking at the type candidates run, the fact they had no experience, and the fact that a lot of them were running with very little money, that also says a lot. That means ground was gained very inexpensively. Okay, so we need to talk about what actually went wrong. Now, if we had higher expectations, could we have done closer to those expectations than what was actually done? Well, um, I need to give you a little background to understand what went wrong. And to understand what went wrong, you need to understand how absolutely dysfunctional the GOP is as a party. Okay, so I'm going to take you back in time and we're going to go to 2016. And we're going to go to the Republican presidential primaries. So we ended up in the summer where we got to a position where we're down to three candidates. We had Trump, who was pretty much in the lead. We had Ted Cruz, who was in second, but still had a viable path to victory. And then we had Kasich, okay, who had no ability to win. There was literally no path forward for him. He could not win under any circumstance. He could not alter Trump's trajectory. The only thing he could do was prevent Ted Cruz from winning. Okay, Kasich is an establishment progressive Republican. He does what he's told by the upper ups. So he stayed in, almost certainly under orders, for the sole purpose of preventing Ted Cruz from becoming the presidential candidate for the Republican Party. Now, why on earth would they do that? Well, so essentially, the establishment GOP was absolutely in a fit of rage at the fact that all their wonderful candidates, Jeb Bush and others, got blown out of the water. They were furious that the plebes had come in and basically taken over their little apple cart. They were just enraged. So the way they were going to play out their rage, because they looked at the field, they said, okay, well, Trump's a clown. Ted Cruz is the person that, the non-establishment part of the party likes. So he's a constitutionalist. He's a perhaps real social conservative. So by having Cruz blown out of the water, that was their way of saying, we're still in control of this thing. You're not getting your candidate. And what's worse, okay, at the point, you got to remember the summer of 2016, at the point Trump won, the absolute, across the board, conventional wisdom, very, very few people saying otherwise, was Trump was going to get his ass handed to him. That Clinton was pretty much already there. She'd already won. It was going to be a landslide of the ages. It was going to be the greatest humiliation ever heaped upon somebody who ran for the president. And the establishment Republicans knew this when they kept Kasich in to blow Ted Cruz out of the race and let Trump win. They believed and they knew the conventional wisdom was Trump was going to lose, and not only was he going to lose, it was going to be historical. Why would they do that? Well, because they think somebody like Hillary Clinton would have been a better president than Ted Cruz. Okay? Because they're progressives. Hillary's a progressive. So if you can't get a progressive light from the Republican wing, progressive heavy from the Democrats is acceptable. And to a certain extent, they view Hillary as an acceptable, moderate Democratic progressive. That's how dysfunctional this party is. So that same background simmering issue has never gone away. It's still there. Okay, so what happens this election? Well, Trump gets involved and he ends up pushing up a lot of people who were friends of his, people who helped him out in tough in tough corners, etc., etc. And overwhelmingly, a lot of these people were political neophytes. They hadn't run campaigns before, and the ones who had run campaigns before hadn't run them at the level they were running. So essentially, we got put into these candidates got put into a position where they weren't They didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the staff, they didn't have the skills to win the kind of races they were going into. Okay. So what makes it worse? Well, the progressives of the GOP party often have the large piles of cash that are needed to make things work. People like Mitt Romney wouldn't help out fellow Republicans who weren't part of his wing. Mitch McConnell uh, diverted money away from campaigns that were outside chances of winning, but they were at least in play. They were far closer to being in play than anyone might have suspected. And they shifted money over to uh, races where the Republicans were absolutely going to win and didn't actually need any more money in it. So the progressive wing of the GOP party helped sabotage this election. Now, we don't know how much. I mean, it could have ended up being maybe only a handful of races. Maybe none. Maybe none of them would have been changed if the GOP had had a different strategy. But the point being is, we know from past performance that the progressive wing of the GOP party will sabotage even their own presidential candidate if they're having a hissy fit and they're in a fit of rage. So why wouldn't they do it to lower level candidates, which they appear to have? You could say, well, maybe they were just making bad decisions. No, I think they were making very overt and rational decisions in terms of how they look at the world. They want to be fully in control of their party again, and the more of these non-progressives that lose, the more power they have. So that's my take on what's going on with the GOP. So what do you think? If there had been, in the comments below, tell me if you think if the GOP progressives had essentially had a smarter strategy, would the GOP have picked up a few more seats? How many? What do you think? Do you think the GOP progressives are here to stay forever? Is there any way the GOP can get rid of them? Is there any way the party can become functional again? Hey, if you liked my content, please smash the like button. If you know somebody who might find this interesting, consider sharing with them. And also, please consider subscribing. Put out a handful of these each week. Could be politics, could be current events, could be philosophical, could be economics, could be history. I got a wide area of interest. Well, thank you for spending time with me tonight. Hope to see you again in a future video.